But let me wrap up the week with a rather disturbing assessment that pulls together a lot of the issues we've been examining lately. And it's this. The Albanese Labor government is gradually revealing a radical agenda, a series of changes that might rival the Whitlam government for the damage they do to this country without any of the benefits. It's deeply worrying, and we need to see the coalition doing more to expose this, contest this, and provide alternatives. Let me start with the good news. Anthony Albanese has surprised us on the upside when it comes to foreign policy and defence. He and Penny Wong have shown strength, certitude and continuity in standing up to China, in engaging with Japan, India and Indonesia on AUKUS, on Ukraine and on recalibrating in the Pacific. Their only weakness in foreign policy is their incessant virtue signalling and kowtowing on climate. And that leads me to some of the radical changes that will be damaging to this nation. First, they've signed up to the United Nations Global Loss and Damage Fund that will see Australia pay untold millions or billions to other nations as climate compensation. We could even be sending money to China, money we should be spending to prepare our defences against China or making ourselves less economically dependent on China trade. Instead, we could send it to China as some sort of climate ransom, even though China is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world and it's still building coal-fired power stations, still increasing its emissions. This stuff is so absurd, you couldn't put it up as satire. But Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese have put us up for it, and for good measure, they're bidding to host a major United Nations climate conference in 2026. So we'll keep shoveling out money on this hopeless agenda of wealth redistribution and anti-capitalist guilt-tripping. This all comes on top of the economic self-harm of Labor's renewables push. It's renewables energies push. It's instead of pulling back on this shift that has forced prices up and supplies down, Labor are going to double down on their renewables push. It's already hurting families and businesses. The experts tell us it can't be done, but they're ploughing ahead with it all. We had a reminder this week about how insane this stuff is. These climate-driven renewables policies are designed to force out fossil fuel generation, right? That's their aim. The whole idea is to replace coal and gas. And they're very successful at that. Too successful, in fact. They're killing off coal and gas before we've got anything to replace them with, hence the cost and supply crisis. And this week, AGL announced it'll bring forward the closure of a major gas-fired generator in South Australia. Torrens Island B, it's called, the largest generator of any kind left in that state. It'll now close in 2026 instead of 2035. Now, this is the state's main backup for when the wind isn't blowing. Otherwise, South Australia relies on connections to Victoria. And we saw what happened when that was tripped a few years back. The whole state was blacked out. So get this, the South Australian government is going to pay AGL $20 million to keep this gas-fired generator going until 2026. Governments push renewables to force out fossil fuels, subsidising the renewables. Then they subsidise the fossil fuels because they want them to stay. It is madness. And why does South Australia know it'll be okay after 2026? Well, not because of the renewables and the batteries, they can't do the job, but because by then they'll have a new interconnector to New South Wales, and that can send in more coal-fired power when it's needed. Until all the coal is shut down in New South Wales, I suppose, what then? This stuff is mad. The states are as mad as Canberra, but Albanese and Bowen are intent on leading the way. They'll turn this energy-rich nation into an energy basket case where our emissions will go into freefall because industries will close and jobs will disappear offshore. So how else will they change the country? Well, these industrial relations laws, I've showed them to you before, 250 pages of them. They weren't promised, they weren't foreshadowed, but they will dramatically increase union powers in this country. They'll lead to widespread industrial action, crush businesses, add to the cost of living, cost jobs, and add a substantial burden to the economy at a precarious time when recession is a real threat. We'll have strikes like it's the 1970s. Then there's border protection. As I outlined last night, the granting of permanent residency to 30,000 illegal arrivals and the likelihood that as many again, maybe more, will come and join them from source countries as part of family reunions. There are even reports that some of these people who claimed to be refugees in fear of their lives in places like Afghanistan or Sri Lanka and were found not to be refugees but got to stay here anyway, well, some have been allowed to fly back to these countries for holidays, places they were supposedly under threat, and then come back to Australia. We are being taken for a ride. But the worst aspect of these changes is they put the sugar back on the table. When news of all this gets out, the people smugglers and their customers will be emboldened to give their evil trade another go. And the last thing this country and those people need is that sort of trauma all over again. All this is happening on top of the budgetary worries, Labor's big spending, historically high levels of debt, and the fact it has no real plan to get the budget back into surplus anytime soon and get the debt under control. Look, then there's all the woke stuff in schools and universities and workplaces. All this is already getting worse because there's just no pushback from Labor. And to cap it all off, watch out for some in Labor to join the push on the voting age. New Zealand is talking about dropping the voting age to 16, and here in Australia the Greens already have that as official policy, and one of the Teals is already pushing for it too. The temptation of giving voice to more naive, emotional young voters might be too strong for Labor. The bottom line here is that there needs to be more attention focused on what this government is doing, and the coalition needs to lead the way with alternative approaches. One big problem is that the so-called Liberal moderates, the woke wing of the Liberal Party, well, they just cheer along with a lot of this stuff, especially on climate change and energy, but also some of the woke agenda. Mainstream values, mainstream economics and mainstream priorities need a stronger voice because Australia is changing for the worse before our very eyes.